Hi everyone, it's me, Nick Dagan Best, your friendly neighborhood astrologer, coming to you live once again from my office. And yet another Sunday without my dear partner, Patrick Watson, who is still attending to family matters as we speak. So we will be proceeding without him for today, but I expect him back next Sunday. So if you're a big old Patrick Watson stan, if you only tune in for him and just wish I would, disappear, well, pity. At least you'll have him back next week, and then only have to tolerate me half as much as you will this week. So there you go. Right. Morning. Hi, LSX. How are you? I thought today I would. Let's see. I've done a few things. I've gone and seen Oppenheimer and Barbie. Um, I don't know how many of you are patrons of Chris Brennan's Astrology podcast, but I made an appearance on his casual episode, the episode that is only sent out to patrons. So you only would have seen this episode if you support Chris Brennan's Astrology podcast. But if you did see that, you got to see Chris and I talk about the Venus retrograde transit and its correlation with the release of those two movies. And we had a great time. It was a really good episode. But Chris and I still keep finding stuff. we almost taped the episode too soon. Just early this morning, I was doing some more research and discovered that the hearing that you see at the end of the movie, when Robert Downey Jr.'s character Strauss is denied his position on the as a Secretary of Energy. Not of the economy secretary. He's going to be appointed to that position, and he's turned down at the last minute because of the shenanigans he was involved with involving J. Robert Oppenheimer. Anyway, long story short, that event happened on June 19th, 1959, which was just as Venus was about to reach its greatest elongation and start the red 5 interval. So that would have been a good one to sort of include in the conversation, but there you go. It didn't happen. I've been making charts for a lot of the scientists. I mean, I had a few scientists related to the Manhattan Project in my database, but going through the cast list of the movie and looking up all the different people involved in the Manhattan Project. And yeah, I want to get a sort of astrological overview of the Manhattan Project. That was something I've been meaning to get to for a long time now. After I'm finished reading American Prometheus, I'm going to read Richard Rhodes's book, The Making of the Atom Bomb. And I've had those books in my library for well over 5 years, and I've been meaning to get around to them. And here I am, catching the wave of nuclear enthusiasm, for want of a better term. Anyway, I didn't, as usual, I'm starting today's stream with no plan. I wasn't sure until yesterday if Patrick would be with me or not. Tomorrow's stream, of course, is going to be, it's going to start an hour earlier, and I'm going to have Sam Reynolds guesting. We're going to pick up where we left off. Excuse me. Sam and I are going to keep talking about Venus retrograde and the history of U.S. race relations. So I hope you'll tune in for that. And today I just thought I would go through some more of my slides. Like last week, we went through Red 5, and I just talked about different Red 5 people. And today I thought I would select a different interval and talk about people in my slideshow who are born during that particular interval. So without further ado, I am going to look at the black ones. Okay. So here we are. My black one intervals. Is that the one I wanted to do? I thought that was the one I had done some work on. It's not. Let's see here. What's one of the other ones I did more recently? I know I definitely did some white threes. Let's look at them. All right, sorry about that confusion. Oh, there we are. There's Barbie. Okay, so I'm looking at white threes today, just randomly picking a different interval. The reason I like to go through these is, people keep asking me, what does this interval mean? What does that interval mean? And I want to take you folks through some of them one by one, and you start to get a sense of the personalities. Um, I am working on updating all of these. That's why, I mean, you do see Margot Robbie here. I'm putting more sort of contemporary people, adding them to the list of historical figures that I already have in these slides, to sort of, yeah, give people some more familiar faces. All right, and the white three is the interval. This has a really strong connection with music. This is the one that has a lot of the really famous composers of 20th century music. Michael Jackson, Paul McCartney, Ray Charles, Prince. You're going to see a bunch of them coming up. So that's one of the components of the white three. But there's some other interesting people as well. All right, so Margot Robbie. Before that, this is Katya Samutsevich. She's one of the members of Pussy Riot. She was one of the three arrested in 2012 when they made that performance at the cathedral there in Moscow. But she was the only one of the three who wasn't convicted. She was given a suspended sentence at the trial. Prince William, yeah, there. Well, what do we actually here? It says second in line to the British throne because when I made this slide, his grandmother was still alive. He is now heir to the throne, so actually I have to update that slide. So there you go. Prince William is a white three. Janet Jackson. Yeah, there's three Jacksons. Three of the Jackson siblings are white threes. This is sort of interesting. When I look at siblings and intervals, it's very common. When I look at big families like, the Jacksons, the Bonapartes, the Kennedys, where there were 9 kids. When you have those big families, it's really amazing how you'll get 2 or more of the kids in a given family born during the same Venus interval. If it's one of these big families and the kids are ranging over a decade in age. This is Anna Politkovskaya. She was a Russian journalist. She was assassinated at her apartment for being very critical of the Chechen War. It's something that tends to happen in Russia. All right, here we are, the second Jackson. So I showed you Janet Jackson a minute ago. This is Michael Jackson. He's a white three interval, just like his sister. And there's going to be yet another Jackson coming up. Madonna, also a white three. And Prince, the three of them, the three great 80s icons, Prince, Madonna, and Michael Jackson, all born, within a few weeks of each other. Prince is a little, maybe like 2 months older than Madonna, but then she's only about a week or so older than Michael. So there's the three of them, three music superstars. Lance Ito, he was the judge at the O.J. Simpson trial, so he's not a musician, but he was famous for a little while O.J. Simpson was on his murder trial. This is another Russian who was assassinated. This is Sergei Yushchenkov, and he was a Russian liberal politician who was assassinated in 2003. And here's our third Jackson. Rebbe Jackson is the oldest sister, the oldest sibling of the Jackson family, and the least famous, since she didn't have a music career like the rest of them. I think she was on their TV show for a little while when they had a TV show in the 70s. But other than that, she's easily the most obscure of the Jackson siblings. But she's a white three. She's 8 years older than Michael and 16 years older than Janet. So that's really interesting in and of itself. William Barr. Okay, well, so he was Trump's attorney general. He was also George H.W. Bush's attorney general. So he's been attorney general twice. My notes say he's an ally of U.S. President Donald Trump. That's no longer true. So I made this slide a while ago. I should update that. He's no longer an ally of Donald Trump, it seems. They have broken. Stevie Wonder, back to the musicians. So yeah, like I was saying, there's a lot of musical giants in the white three interval. That seems to be one of the, again, as you can see, not everyone born during the white three interval is a great musician, but a lot of great musicians, especially in the 20th century, are born white threes, like Stevie Wonder and Paul McCartney, Ebony and Ivory. Look at that, the two of them. Paul McCartney, also a white three. John Lennon was a white two, just for your curiosity. Thabo Mbeki was the second president of South Africa, of the new South Africa. He followed Nelson Mandela to run South Africa. His father was also a sort of a compatriot of Nelson Mandela. Govan Mbeki, who was another one of the defendants at the famous Rivonia trial of 1964, where they were all sentenced to life in prison, including Nelson Mandela. John Ashcroft. So another attorney general. I showed you William Barr not long ago. John Ashcroft was George W. Bush's attorney general. And yeah, he's a white three. Bob Heppel, this is going back to South Africa. He was one of the lawyers and, well, he was also a defendant in the Rivonia trial, but he was an anti-apartheid activist and a lawyer. So he went on trial alongside Thabo Mbeki's father, Govan, who also I think is a white three, who's coming up soon. There's a few South Africans coming up in white threes. Allen Ginsberg, the poet, part of the Beat generation, rather notorious figure. He's a white three. Marilyn Monroe, actress, iconic sex symbol, also a white three. Miles Davis, speak of the great musicians, alongside Paul McCartney, Stevie Wonder, Prince, Michael Jackson. Miles Davis is another one of these great white three composers. I think I said Ray Charles earlier, but he's a red two. He's almost a white three. He's close to the white three, but yeah, I screwed up when I said Ray Charles. I forget why I said that for some reason. I forgot he's a red two. And not that I don't know the difference. I listen to a lot of both. Anyway, this is Miles Davis, a white three. Virgilio Gonzalez. He was one of the Watergate burglars. So he's a Cuban anti-Castro figure. And yeah, he was involved in the Bay of Pigs invasion, and he was a Watergate burglar. Alexander Shilipin. He was a Soviet politician. At one point, chairman of the KGB and chairman of the All-Union Central Council of Trade Unions. Anyway, one of these figures I study from the Soviet Union. Nelson Mandela, speaking of South Africans, the great man, first president of South Africa, and of course he served 27 years of a life sentence in prison for anti-apartheid activism. Yeah, the great Nelson Mandela is a white three. And Govan Mbeki, I showed you his son a little earlier. Thabo Mbeki, this is Govan Mbeki, another one of the Rivonia trial defendants that I was speaking about earlier. So quite a few white threes involved in that trial. Abe Fortas was a Supreme Court judge who had to resign over some ethics issues. He had been appointed by his old friend Lyndon Johnson, and then didn't serve too long, and it was found he had some corrupt connections, and he had to resign. Whoops, I'm going forward instead of backward. Robert Anderson was a secretary of the Treasury, I think, for Roosevelt. But he, yeah, I think for Roosevelt. I could be wrong. It might actually be Eisenhower, come to think of it. Yeah, and he was also a deputy secretary of defense and a secretary of the Navy. So I think he served both Roosevelt and Eisenhower, I think, if I remember correctly. Aldous Huxley, the author. Yeah, you know, Doors of Perception, yada, yada, yada. What's the other book I'm thinking of? Brave New World. Yeah, famous author who died the same day as John F. Kennedy. Gavrilo Princip. This is the Serbian nationalist assassin who killed the Archduke Franz Ferdinand that started the First World War. So he was a white three. Yeah, I think we're going to be getting into a few sort of revolutionary figures here as we go into the 19th century. Kenneth Claiborne Royal was he was Secretary of War under Roosevelt and Truman, and that position was changed to Secretary of the Army. Or no, he was Secretary of the Army, and then he became Secretary of War. Sorry, the Secretary of the Army was changed to the Secretary of War. And there's also Secretary of Defense. It all got sort of changed around with Truman, and he was there for all of that when everything was sort of reshuffled. This is another Supreme Court Justice, Wiley Blount Rutledge. There's going to be a few Supreme Court justices here. Oh, and earlier I showed you Prince William, the heir to the throne. Well, this was Edward, Duke of Windsor, who was the heir to the throne, became King Edward VIII, and then abdicated to marry an American divorcee, Wallis Simpson. Both of them have the same Venuses, too, very close to Algol. This is Edward Spears. He's a British Army officer. Yeah, he was sort of an important figure during the two world wars, involved in diplomacy and things of that nature. Francis Biddle, yet another attorney general. So you see, sometimes it comes to a given sort of cabinet post in the president's cabinet, and you see a lot of intervals, people born in the same interval occupying that same position. So this is another attorney general. He was Franklin Roosevelt's attorney general, Francis Biddle. Nazis. Yeah, occasionally there will be Nazis. This is Werner von Blomberg. He was forced to resign because someone found pornographic pictures of his wife, and so he was disgraced and had to resign. Pyotr Wrangel, he was what you called a white Russian. He was against he was a Russian army commander who was against the Bolsheviks, and so the Bolsheviks were the red Russians and the anti-Bolsheviks were the white Russians. So yeah, he tried to fight the Bolsheviks during the Russian Civil War and lost. Yes, and speaking of Russia and speaking of revolutionaries, this is Yakov Yurovsky. He's the Bolshevik who ordered the shooting of the royal family in the basement. That shooting was done during a white 3 interval. And Yakov Yurovsky, who led that assassination plot, was also a white 3. So he committed the murder during the same interval he was born under. And more revolutionaries. This is Pancho Villa. He's a Mexican bandito chieftain revolutionary. And yeah, he invaded the USA a few times on raids before he was finally assassinated in the later days of the Mexican Revolutionary War. Gustav Stresemann was an important German chancellor during the Weimar years, one of the more sort of capable leaders that the ill-fated regime had. And yeah, he was a white 3. Funny, most of those chancellors of the German Weimar Republic, I think, were born during red intervals, but he's one of the only white intervals born at that time. And he did a lot better than most of them. He just died too soon. And going back to white Russians, this is Lavr Kornilov. He's a Siberian Cossack, and he's another one of these white Russian military leaders who fought in the Civil War against the Bolsheviks. Vladimir Purushkevich. This is a Russian monarchist, and he sort of participated in the conspiracy against Rasputin and the murder of Rasputin. Oh yeah, this guy. This is Gustav Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach. He was a German arms manufacturer from the Krupp family, and he was put on trial at Nuremberg, but the charges were actually dropped against him. I think he was too old and senile, and they didn't want to put him on trial. But he was, just as guilty as the Nazis he was on trial with. This is R.B. Bennett. He was a Canadian prime minister. If I remember correctly, he died by having a heart attack in the bath and was like sort of boiled to death in his bath or something gruesome like that. I forget the details, but I think that was how he died. Something weird like that. Queen Sophie of the Hellenes. She's the younger sister of Kaiser Wilhelm II, and she sort of, through marriage, connected the German and Greek thrones. She married the heir to the Greek throne, and she was queen of Greece for a little while. And I think her husband, was it her husband who was murdered? Possibly. He was assassinated, and then 2 of her sons became kings of Greece as well. Benjamin Cardozo, this is another US Supreme Court justice. Yeah, I think he was appointed, he was the only justice appointed by Herbert Hoover, if I remember correctly, and died while Roosevelt was in office. Jan Smuts, this is another South African leader. I showed you Nelson Mandela and Thabo Mbeki and Govan Mbeki. Well, Jan Smuts was an Afrikaner leader of the old South Africa. He was a prime minister and a political leader during both world wars. He was actually quite important during the world wars, instrumental in help setting up the United Nations. And yeah, there he is, a white 3. And then his predecessor, the first prime minister of South Africa, Louis Botha, was also a white 3. So you see a lot of white 3 leaders in South Africa, both from the old Afrikaner white regime and then from the post-apartheid modern day South Africa. This is Louis Barthou. He was a prime minister of France. He was assassinated alongside King Alexander I of Yugoslavia in which French town was it now? Not Bordeaux. What's that? Anyway, Marseille. I think they were murdered in Marseille in the streets. There's film of it in 1934. It's the first assassination caught on film. Claude Debussy, who's the great composer. Yeah, well, you either know him or you don't, but yes, he's a great French composer, and he's a white 3. So remember all those other musicians: Miles Davis, Paul McCartney, Prince. This is another sort of classic white 3 musician. And then I'm back to the White Russian general. So you see sort of clusters on certain subjects. Just like you've seen a lot of South African leaders, you also see a lot of these people involved in the Russian Civil War who were white 3s. And this is another one. This is Nikolai Yudenich, and he's yet another Russian military leader who fought for the White Russians against the Bolsheviks. And now we have Walter Fisher, who was the Secretary of the Interior in the United States government. Yeah, nothing remarkable about him, just showing him to you. This is Foreign Minister of Austria-Hungary of the Habsburg Empire. His name was Aehrenthal, Alois Lexa von Aehrenthal. And he was involved in this very important negotiation with the Russian foreign minister, Alexander Zvolsky, during a Bosnian crisis. But it's sort of, Aehrenthal got the better of Zvolsky and got some concessions on Bulgaria that the Russians would be very upset about. And this is in the years leading up to the First World War, which of course was really sort of more than anything a schism between the Habsburgs and Russia. So he in his own way helped make things just a little bit worse between Austria-Hungary and Russia leading up to the war. Robert Borden. This is another Canadian Prime Minister. I showed you R.B. Bennett earlier. So yeah, we've had a couple of white 3 Canadian Prime Ministers. This was the guy who was Prime Minister of Canada during the First World War. So there you go, Robert Borden. His face is on, I think, the Canadian $50 bill, if I remember correctly. It's been a long while since I held currency in my hand. This is another Secretary of War for the United States, Luke Edward Wright. He was also an ambassador to Japan and a Governor General of the Philippines. Rose Cleveland, she came up a few weeks ago when I was doing my survey of First Ladies of the United States. So this is Rose Cleveland, who was the acting First Lady of the USA, the sister of US President Grover Cleveland. This is Porfirio Diaz. I showed you Pancho Villa a little while ago. But this is Porfirio Diaz, who was the president of Mexico that he was in power when the Mexican Revolution broke out. So when Pancho Villa and all those others were rebelling against him. So he was a sort of long-term caudillo of Mexico. And yeah, we were speaking about the First World War earlier. I showed you Gavrilo Princip, who assassinated the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Well, this is Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria-Hungary. He was the actual Emperor of Austria when the First World War broke out. He had been the emperor since 1848, and he would die in the middle of the war in 1916. Camille Pissarro is a famous French painter, one of the Impressionists. Yeah, co-founder of the Impressionist movement, very great painter. Yet another U.S. secretary. This is Secretary of the Interior Henry Teller. And president. I think this one of the only U.S. presidents, if not the only U.S. president, born during a white three. This is Rutherford Hayes, 19th president of the United States, former governor of Ohio. Then another secretary, U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, William Fessenden. I think he was in Lincoln's cabinet. Another secretary, Secretary of War, 24th U.S. Secretary of War, John B. Floyd, who had also been a governor of Virginia. John Adams Dix, a governor of New York and a U.S. minister to France. John Eaton, yet another Secretary of War, U.S. minister to Spain. I think he was Andrew Jackson's Secretary of War. And a Secretary of State, Secretary of the Navy, Abel P. Upshur. He was William Henry Harrison's Secretary of State, and then and then William Henry Harrison died, of course, after 30 days, and you got John Tyler. And Upshur was killed in an explosion. You know, those old steamships they were at risk of exploding, and the USS Princeton exploded, and he was killed in this explosion while he was Secretary of State to John Tyler. Quite a heavy-duty time in U.S. politics. The president keels over after 30 days, and then the Secretary of State is killed in an explosion. Oh, America. Then we get yet another Secretary of State, Secretary of War, Lewis Cass. So you see a lot of these white threes in this early part of the United States history having important, positions on the presidential cabinet. So yeah, Secretary of War and Secretary of State, Lewis Cass. Daniel Tompkins of New York City's famous Tompkins Square Park fame. He was the 6th Vice President of the USA, and he was a governor of New York. This is Napoleon's mother, Letizia Romolino Bonaparte, mother of 13 children, 8 of whom survived infancy, including little Napoleon. This is Fabre d'Églantine. He was a French revolutionary famous for developing the revolutionary calendar. With the French Revolution, they came up with the metric system, but they also came up with a new calendar that stuck around for about 10 years before Napoleon reversed it. And d'Églantine was eventually executed at the guillotine alongside Danton on the 5th of April, 1794. I think he was involved in some foreign corruption. He had some investments abroad that were suspicious, if I remember correctly. Yet another Secretary of War. So we've seen a lot of this, haven't we? This is Henry Knox of I think Fort Knox is named after him. He was an officer in the U.S. Army during the Continental War, and he was Secretary of War for the Continental States. And then he was the very first Secretary of War in George Washington's cabinet. And then we have some popes. This is Pope Pius VII, 251st Pope of the Catholic Church. He's the one who signed the Concordat with Napoleon, and he was present at Napoleon's coronation. He was present to watch Napoleon crown himself. And that's it. Those are my white threes, and I've taken you through all the white threes that I have in my slideshow so far. Okay. The Krupp family like the appliances. Yes, that's quite right. Another fantastic NDB quote. Occasionally there will be Nazis. Yeah, there weren't that many. I notice red interval musicians are into things that seem alternative. Chris Cornell is a red 3. Kurt Cobain's a black 1. Jerry Cantrell, I think, is a red 4, if I remember correctly. So Kurt Cobain is not a red interval musician, but Chris Cornell and Jerry Cantrell are. Michael Jackson and Madonna dating? I don't think that's true. Maybe maybe you know how Michael Jackson sort of dated Brooke Shields, but I mean, what was that? They went they went out to a couple of events together. I don't think Michael really dated women the way you think of it. I don't have any thoughts on the UFO testimony. It's all too soon to comment on. I like to comment on stuff we have some distance on. GF Martello's waiting for Black Fours. Okay, well, I can do Black Fours too. Black Fours. Okay, I can talk about Black Fours. And Eden says, I'm an expat South African and appreciate me including political figures in the discussion. Yeah, I'm very interested in South African history and politics. All right, maybe we look at some Black Fours since I'm getting some requests for that. This is how I want to spend the next few, at least solo live streams. Next week when Watson's back, he and I have been doing, he's working on this thing, tracking, the heliacal risings and settings of planets when they appear, when they disappear from view. And we did some really exciting work the other day using my astronomy software, and we're discovering some interesting stuff. So I imagine we're probably going to cover that stuff when he comes back, and that's going to be really exciting. So I hope you all come back for next week's live stream when Watson's back, and we show that stuff to you guys, because it's pretty exciting, and you get to be in on the ground floor as we're sort of working out the details of the Venus synodic cycle and how it appears on a map. All right, am I sharing the screen with you? No, I'm not, am I? Yes, I am. Okay, I am sharing the screen with you. And here I thought I wasn't. Oh, I know why that's confusing me. All right, here we go. So we're going to talk about some Black Fours. I did add some more to the slideshow, so at least we have some modern ones. This is Millie Bobby Brown. She's a young actress. She's not even 20 years old yet, but she's in Stranger Things, the show Stranger Things, and she is the youngest UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador appointee. Florence Pugh, who I just saw in Oppenheimer. She plays Jean Tatlock. She's very good in the movie, and of course, she's a really good actress. Really amazing with accents. One of those actors who can speak in a lot of different accents. Yeah, that's Florence Pugh. Another young movie star, Timothy Chalamet. Timothée Chalamet. No, sorry, Timothy Chalamet. Also a young actor, young movie star. I saw him in Dune. I think he was also in, he played Jennifer Lawrence's boyfriend in that movie, Don't Look Up, right? But yeah, he was really good in Dune. I'm enjoying the Dune series so far, the new one. So yeah, that's Timothy Chalamet. I'm sorry. I'm getting loopy. Kendall Jenner. Yeah, I've been throwing in the Jenners and the Kardashians and all them into the slideshow. There's enough of them to go around. So yeah, this is Kendall Jenner, one of the young Jenners, daughter of Caitlyn and Kris Jenner. Rihanna is a Black Four. So does she need any introduction? I doubt it. It's Rihanna. She's a Black Four. Most watched Super Bowl show ever from the Barbados. Rihanna. Ronan Farrow. Supposedly the son of Mia Farrow and Woody Allen, probably the son of Mia Farrow and Frank Sinatra, because he just looks so much more like Frank Sinatra, and he doesn't look at all like Woody Allen. He's a journalist. He was really important in sort of getting the Me Too movement happening. And yeah, he's pretty well known in the US, journalist Ronan Farrow. Chelsea Manning, activist, whistleblower, trans woman, and yeah, disclosed nearly 750,000 classified or sensitive documents to WikiLeaks. Chelsea Manning. Actress Christina Ricci is a Black Four. Oh, I forgot to update her slides, and it says she disclosed 750 classified documents to WikiLeaks, and that she's a trans woman. But I just want to assure you, that's just me being sloppy. Christina Ricci is not a trans woman, and she did not disclose 750,000 classified documents to WikiLeaks. My bad. Sometimes I only notice those errors. That's really funny, though. Oh, Nick, can you get anything right? Okay. Um, Ben Sass is a U.S. senator, a Republican senator from Nebraska. And I have another error there. It says he's from New Brunswick, but he's not. He's from Nebraska. I gotta fix that. Jeez, what's all this sloppiness? This is Amy Coney Barrett. She, of course, is a U.S. Supreme Court justice appointed by Donald Trump. She's appointed by Trump. Justin Trudeau, of course, is the Prime Minister of Canada, and his father was a Prime Minister as well. Sarah Palin, ninth governor of Alaska, and she was a vice presidential candidate in 2008. Fareed Zakaria, a CNN commentator and journalist, who I'm sure you've seen on the cable news, whether you deliberately watch CNN or not. Michelle Obama, First Lady of the USA, wife of former President Barack Obama. Jeff Bezos, the founder and CEO of Amazon and one of the world's wealthiest people. Nicolas Cage, actor, Academy Award-winning actor for Leaving Las Vegas, the great Nicolas Cage of the Coppola family. Mike Pompeo, who was Secretary of State under Trump, and you still see him around. He was also director of the CIA at one point. Brad Pitt, who's won a Best Supporting Actor Academy Award. The great Brad Pitt is a Black 4 interval. Christopher Darden, going back to the O.J. Simpson trial, Christopher Darden was one of the prosecuting attorneys in the O.J. Simpson trial. Bryan Cranston, so this is another actor. You probably know him from Breaking Bad, Malcolm in the Middle. The great Bryan Cranston is also a Black 4 interval. This is Frank Walter Steinmeier. He was president of Germany not too long ago, back when Merkel was chancellor. Al Gore is a Black 4. Oh, it looks like I need to fix Al Gore's page too. Just bear with me for a second here, folks. There we go. All right. 0.76. Okay. I know, something like that. All right, sorry about that. I just didn't want it to be blurry. I thought I fixed all these things. All right, so Al Gore, former vice president of the U.S. and former candidate for president, the Democratic candidate in 2000. Patricia Krenwinkel, who was one of the Manson family killers. She murdered Abigail Folger during the Tate murders in August of 1969, and she's still in prison. Patrick Leahy, U.S. Senator, former President pro tempore emeritus of the U.S. Senate. Chuck Norris, martial arts movie star and film producer. Hank Brown, this is another senator. He just served one term, and he was a mediator between Russia and the Taliban during the Afghan war, I believe. Joachim Gauck, this is another president of Germany. So Germany went through a little period where it had a number of prominent Black 4 politicians. Angela Merkel herself is a Black 3 interval, like Trump, but a lot of the people around her presidents and other officials, were Black 4s. This is Laurent Désiré Kabila. He was the third president of the Democratic Republic of Congo. He was. Whoops! Why did that just do that? cut it out. Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, he was involved in the Great African War, fighting Mobutu of Zaire, who he eventually defeated, and then he was assassinated in 2001 and replaced by his son. So this was a guy who was fighting Mobutu in the Congo since the days of Che Guevara. Che Guevara knew him. And Elizabeth Taylor is a Black Four, born in 1932, married 7 times to 6 different men, the great, the stunning Elizabeth Taylor, and her time twin, Johnny Cash. Johnny Cash and Elizabeth Taylor were born barely a day apart. And in 1983, the two of them met up at the Betty Ford drug clinic. And when they discovered that they were born just a day apart, they sent each other birthday cards every year for each other's birthday for the rest of their lives until Johnny died 20 years later in 2003. So at some point, I'm going to do a video about Johnny Cash and Elizabeth Taylor and Mars transits, because Mars is a really big deal with the two of them. And yeah, there's a lot of really interesting astrology studying the two of them together. Excuse me. Ted Kennedy's a Black Four interval. So Ted Kennedy, of course, the younger brother of John F. Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy, who served as a senator for a long time before he died in 2009. Edwin Meese, he was an attorney general under Ronald Reagan, participated in the Iran-Contra cover-up. Arthur Chaskelson, this is another South African. He was a defense attorney in the Rivonia trial that I was talking about earlier for Nelson Mandela and his compatriots in 1964. Marlon Brando is a Black Four interval. So we've seen some of these older, like glamorous movie stars like Elizabeth Taylor, Marlon Brando. And today, Millie Bobby Brown. Yeah, there's some glamour in the Black Four, some intensity, some mumbling. Robert Mugabe, who's the president of Zimbabwe. He died not too long ago, but he was in power right from the end of the Civil War, the Zimbabwe Civil War against the Rhodesians, also called the Rhodesian Bush War. He was president right up until he was deposed in 2017, not too long before he died. He really kind of ran the country into the ground. Anyway, he was a Black Four. James McCord, who was one of the Watergate burglars. We saw one earlier who was a White 3. This is one of the, he was sort of the leader of the burglars. And he's the one who started testifying that he had perjured himself. And that's what sort of started to unravel the whole Watergate thing for Nixon. So James McCord was kind of an important whistleblower of sorts during the whole Watergate controversy. This is Alexander Yakovlev. He was the Soviet ambassador to Canada, and he had a hand in helping thaw the Cold War, and he was an important sort of ally of Gorbachev during the whole Glasnost period, leading to the dissolution of the Soviet Union. This is John Roosevelt. He's a son of Franklin Roosevelt. I think Franklin Roosevelt, again, when I'm talking about siblings, Franklin Roosevelt had, I think, 2 kids born during the Black Four interval. So this is the youngest of the sons of the youngest child of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. This is Harold Wilson. He was Prime Minister of the UK in the 60s and 70s. He served twice in not consecutive terms, but at 2 different periods. And he's responsible for abolishing capital punishment and decriminalizing homosexuality. We get quite a few South African Black Four leaders here as well. It's interesting. We saw a lot of White 3 ones, but there's this period during the apartheid era where you get a bunch of South African presidents and prime ministers born during the Black Four interval. So this is P.W. Botha, who was prime minister and president mostly in the 1980s. Then before him, his predecessor, John Vorster, who was president of South Africa during the 70s. And I think he resigned over a corruption scandal. And then before him, or I think in between after him, but before Botha, There's Marais Viljoen, who was the last of the ceremonial presidents of South Africa. Yeah, because Botha changed the constitution and merged the positions of president and prime minister into one. At first, you had like a president who was just like a head of state, and then the prime minister who was actually the head of government. And so this is the last of those ceremonial presidents. And then when Botha became prime minister, he changed the constitution, made himself president and prime minister. But anyway, yeah, a lot of these South Africans. And then this is a guy on the other side of the apartheid question. This is Bram Fischer, another South African black 4-interval birth. He was also a defense attorney at the Rivonia trial. You remember I showed you Arthur Chaskelson earlier? But more important, Bram Fischer was someone who eventually he himself was arrested and thrown in prison for his activism, anti-apartheid activism. And he was on, I believe, on Robben Island alongside Mandela and the rest of them. Until the very end of his life, he had cancer in 1975. And so the authorities put him under house arrest. I think he died in his brother's house, but he spent the last, not quite decade, but quite a few years in prison, for fighting apartheid. And that's Bram Fischer. And here's James Roosevelt. This is the other child. You remember I mentioned that Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt had more than one child born during the Black 4-interval. So this is James Roosevelt, who is also a son of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt and a Black 4-interval. This is Hans Frisch. I told you there would be Nazis, and yeah, once in a while there are Nazis. So this is a guy who surrendered Berlin to the Soviet army. So you just know that the unluckiest Nazis are the ones who had to surrender to the Soviets and not the Americans. And so that's one of these guys. He surrendered Berlin to the Soviet army. Adlai Stevenson, who was a governor of Illinois, ambassador to the UN, and twice ran against Eisenhower for president. He was a Democratic candidate for president 2 terms in a row. John Sparkman was a senator from Alabama, and he's one of the Southern senators who signed the famous Southern Manifesto in favor of segregation. This is Richard Huelsenbeck. He's a poet and a writer and a psychoanalyst and a co-founder of the Dada movement in Zurich, which was later transplanted to Berlin. So yeah, the Dada artists, this is sort of the predecessors to the Surrealists. This was an art of protest during the First World War. In Zurich, you had, like, this guy's German, but you had like French, German, Romanian, all these different artists congregating in Zurich who were from countries that were fighting each other in the war at that time. But they sort of got together in neutral Switzerland and created this absurdist art movement that was a protest against the absurd war that was going on. And that's the Dada movement, which later developed into Surrealism. And yeah, you get a lot of really interesting ideas out of that. So he's one of these pioneers. Wendell Willkie, he was a US presidential candidate in 1940. And yeah, he ran against Franklin Roosevelt for Roosevelt's 3rd term. James Forrestal, he's the first Secretary of Defense after Truman moved around the sort of the departments, rearranged the government departments, and created the Secretary of Defense position out of the old Secretary of the Army and Secretary of War positions. So he's the first Secretary of Defense, but he committed suicide under strange circumstances. He jumped out of a building when he was undergoing a mental health crisis. He was in a hospital. So it's often thought to be kind of suspicious, but he's someone who really pops up in a lot of these other books I read about historical figures. Like, he's an early mentor to John F. Kennedy, for instance. So if you read books about Kennedy, he's sort of a mentor to young Kennedy in the late 30s. And yeah, he pops up in books about the CIA and in a bunch of different areas. But anyway, that's James Forrestal. Robert H. Jackson. Okay, so this is another Supreme Court justice. He was also one of the prosecuting attorneys. He was the American prosecuting attorney at the Nuremberg trials. So yeah, really important justice for the Supreme Court and at Nuremberg at the end of the Second World War. This is Daisy Suckley. She's the sixth cousin of Franklin Roosevelt and a close friend. People sometimes think they might have had an affair. It's not really known, but they were very, very close. He was closer to her than he was to Eleanor or to Lucy Mercer, to anyone. She was a very important confidant to Franklin Roosevelt. Harold Alexander was a Governor General of Canada, and he oversaw the end of the Dunkirk evacuation during the Second World War. Theodor Heuss was the first president of West Germany. So this was just as, after the Second World War, when Germany was partitioned into two halves. He was the first president of West Germany, which is, not the same position as chancellor, but there he was. Like I said, there would be there will be Nazis. This is Erich Raeder, who was a German admiral. He was sentenced to life in prison at the Nuremberg trials and released early, so he wasn't executed like some of his fellow Nazis. And here's a pope. This is Pope Pius XI, the 260th pope of the Catholic Church. And he was neutral in the Second World War, which is sometimes seen as controversial, especially when it comes to the evacuation of Jews and not doing anything about the Holocaust, not saying anything about the Holocaust. But yeah, this is Pope Pius XI. And Konrad Adenauer, I showed you the first president of West Germany was a Black Force, so was the first chancellor of West Germany. So right at the, Black Fours were at the top of every important political office with the partition of Germany at the end of the Second World War, which is interesting in and of itself. Okay, so this is the Archduchess Marie Valerie of Austria-Hungary. And she was the daughter of Franz Joseph. I showed you earlier. He was the White Three. He was the Emperor of Austria-Hungary. And she was an archduchess until the monarchy was dissolved at the end of the Second World War, in which case she just became an ordinary citizen. And there's more Nazis. This is Dietrich Eckart, who was sort of a mentor to Adolf Hitler, and he died 6 weeks after the Beer Hall Putsch. And more of these archduchesses and duchesses. This woman's kind of famous. Earlier, I showed you Gavrila Princip, the White Three assassin who started the First World War. Well, this is Duchess Sophia Hohenberg of Austria-Hungary. She's the wife of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and she was murdered alongside Franz Ferdinand. People always talk about the murder of Franz Ferdinand. Well, his wife was murdered too. She was shot. And this is her. She was so her murder is part of what triggered the First World War. Fyodor Golovin. So this is a Russian politician in the years leading up to the First World War. And then he was eventually executed. And he was later a prime minister of Poland and executed there by the Soviets. This is John W. Weeks. He was a Secretary of War, but not during the war. William Jennings Bryan, who was Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson. He ran for president a number of times, definitely against Theodore Roosevelt, and I think against Taft too. He was a big champion for when they abolished alcohol, temperance, or whatever you call it. He created prohibition. Well, he didn't create prohibition, but he was a big champion for prohibition. And of course, he was also against the teaching of evolution. He's famously in the famous Scopes monkey trial of 1925. He took the anti-evolution position and argued for it, and then he died like right after that Scopes trial. So that's William Jennings Bryan. Harry Daugherty he's another U.S. Attorney General. He was in Warren Harding's cabinet, and he was implicated in the Teapot Dome scandal, which you can look up if you're interested in it. This is a vice president of the U.S., Charles Curtis, who was vice president. Geez, who was he vice president under? Was it Taft? No, it wasn't Taft. I forget. I should know. Coolidge maybe? No, it's not Coolidge either. I can't think. Anyway. Théophile Delcasse, he was a foreign minister for the Third French Republic. He secured the Entente Cordiale. So he's sort of an important French politician in the years leading up to the First World War, because he helps create the alliance between France, Great Britain, and Russia. And of course, the three of them will fight against Germany and Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire when the war breaks out. So he's sort of instrumental in setting up that alliance. This is an explorer, a French explorer named Pierre Savagnin de Brazza. You might have heard of Brazzaville, the capital of the French Congo. So yeah, he's a French explorer who claimed Central Africa for France, as if there was no one living there, right? Anyway. Joseph Joffre, this is another important French historical figure. He was a Marshal of France, and he was the Field Marshal during the First World War, important figure during the First World War. This is another chancellor of the German Weimar Republic, but more of a failed one. I showed you Fessenden earlier. Fehrenbach didn't last long as chancellor of the Weimar Republic, and he failed to set a reparations agreement. So his regime did not last long, and he died not long after. This is Lewis Powell, who was one of the attempted assassins of William Seward. So he was in league with John Wilkes Booth when the same night that John Wilkes Booth shot Abraham Lincoln. Powell here was supposed to kill William Seward, who was the U.S. Secretary of State, and he did stab him in the neck, but Seward survived, and Powell was executed not long after with the other conspirators. And speaking of conspirators, this is another guy who was in the Lincoln conspiracy along with Lewis Powell and John Wilkes Booth. This is John Surratt. He managed to escape prosecution and execution. He lived until 1916 because he escaped the country. I think his own mother was executed, though, and he managed to survive. Quite the rat. Horace Harmon Lurton. This is another U.S. Supreme Court justice, but he had also served in the Confederate military. So he served for the Confederates, but then he's later named a U.S. Supreme Court justice. You can see how things went after the war. John Foster was a U.S. Secretary of State. He was also a minister to Mexico, Russia, and Spain. John Foster is kind of important because his grandson is John Foster Dulles, who would also be a U.S. Secretary of State. And his son-in-law is Robert Lansing, who would be a Secretary of State in the First World War to Woodrow Wilson. So there's a whole family of Secretaries of States. And John Foster, yeah, he was Benjamin Harrison's Secretary of State, and he's sort of instrumental in the U.S. taking Hawaii in 1896, whatever it was, 1896, I guess. So yeah, he's kind of like the first of the imperialist U.S. Secretaries of State. And of course, he's the grandfather of John Foster Dulles, who kept up the family tradition. This is another U.S. Supreme Court Justice, Harry Billings Brown. He's the guy who wrote the Plessy v. Ferguson decision, which was a decision that sanctified segregation in American law. Russell Alger was Secretary of War. Horace Gray was another Supreme Court Justice. He helped increase the powers of Congress. Ward Hill was a bodyguard and law partner to Abraham Lincoln and served as a U.S. Marshal. Yeah, well, he didn't he didn't manage to protect Lincoln in the end, but I think he did save Lincoln's life probably a couple of times before Lincoln ultimately was killed at the end of the war. This is Julia Gardner Tyler. She was the second wife of John Tyler, U.S. President John Tyler. She married the White House. She was much younger than him. Remember, he was vice president, and then William Henry Harrison died after 30 days, and so he became president, and then his wife died, and he married a second serving as president in the White House. This is another attorney general. This is Charles Devens. Samuel Blatchford, yet another associate justice for the U.S. He was the first to serve on all three federal judiciary levels. William Tecumseh Sherman, this guy's famous, of course, the commanding general of the U.S. Army, who led the Scorched Earth March through Georgia and South Carolina. James Speed, another attorney general he was attorney general for Abraham Lincoln, and he was also the brother of Lincoln's close friend Joshua Speed. Actually, he might have been attorney general he might have been attorney general actually for Grant instead of Lincoln. But yeah, his brother was a good friend of Lincoln. Henry Wilson, another president of the U.S. He was vice president under it. He died. I think he died in office. Yeah, fourth U.S. vice president to die in office. That's right, Henry Wilson. Alexander Stephens, former governor of Georgia. He was vice president of the Confederate States. In the movie, he's played by what's his name, who played Rorschach in Spielberg's Lincoln movie. Yeah, I forget the name of no, not Haley Joel Osment. What am I thinking of? Earl Haley, Jackie Earl Haley. Is that right? Is that his name? He plays Alexander Stephens. I think that's the guy from Bad News Bears, whatever. He played Rorschach in Watchmen, and he plays Alexander Stephens, who had been a friend of Lincoln, despite later becoming the vice president of the Confederate States. Reverdy Johnson, this is yet another U.S. Attorney General. We've seen quite a few of them in the Black 4 position. John Bell, he was one of the 4 U.S. presidential candidates in 1860, leading up to the Civil War. So he had been a Secretary of War and Speaker of the House, and he was a senator from Tennessee. This is Robert Peel, who was Prime Minister of Great Britain, and he created the modern police force and co-founded Britain's Conservative Party. John Canfield Spencer, former U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, former U.S. Secretary of War, and former Congressman and Secretary of State of New York. John McKinley, yet another Associate Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. Henry Baldwin, yet another Associate Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. There's a lot of these early judges, aren't they? Our Black 4s. Quite a lot of them. William H. Crawford, who was the Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of War, Ambassador to France, and he also ran against, I think, he was competing with Jackson and John Quincy Adams for the presidency at one point, but he was sort of the third wheel in that testy little battle. Caesar Augustus Rodney, yet another former U.S. Attorney General and former senator, minister to Argentina. Edward Livingston, yet another former U.S. Secretary of State and former congressman, former mayor of New York City. William Pinckney, yet another former U.S. Attorney General. Seeing some themes here, guys. Charles Grey, I'm sure you enjoy his tea, Earl Grey. Delicious tea, and he was Prime Minister of the UK, and his administration abolished slavery. This is Jacques-Nicolas Billaud-Varenne. He was a French revolutionary politician and member of the Committee for Public Safety. Aaron Burr, I'm sure you guys have heard of this guy. He's the guy who killed Alexander Hamilton in a duel. He was Vice President of the USA under Thomas Jefferson, and had to go on the lam for killing Alexander Ham. See what I did there? All right, we're almost through. Another French revolutionary. This is Olympe de Gouges. She's sort of an important French revolutionary abolitionist and feminist. She was a playwright and author, and she had to escape France. She certainly would have been guillotined had she stayed in France. Oh, she was guillotined. What am I saying? I'm thinking of someone else. She was guillotined for being sort of outspoken during the French Revolution. Yeah, sorry, for a second I was thinking she was one of the ones who escaped, but she wasn't. She was executed. She did go to the national razor. Schling! And speaking of French revolutionaries, this guy wasn't executed somehow. This is the Marquis de Sade, famous author and revolutionary politician who was incarcerated for many years in prisons and asylums. Yet another Associate Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, John Blair Jr. Yet another Prime Minister of Great Britain, Frederick North, who was Prime Minister during the American Revolutionary War. Yet another associate justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, the second associate justice of the Supreme Court. So literally the second guy that George Washington named to the Supreme Court, William Cushing. And speak of the devil, George Washington, Black Four, the one of the only. Yeah, I think he's the only U.S. president who was a Black Four, right? We've seen a lot of attorney generals. We've seen a lot of Supreme Court justices, but actually George Washington is the first and only Black Four U.S. president. And King George I of Britain, not King George III, who they fought the Revolutionary War against, but his, I think, great-grandfather, George I of Great Britain. And that's it. Those are my Black Fours. All right, my listeners, how are you doing? How have I held up here? Okay, so one person is upset at having the same birthday as Braza. Is there a cycle with no Nazis? No, there's no cycle with no Nazis. What Venus cycle was Winnie Mandela? Good question here. Let me quickly look that up. Winnie Mandela, was either a blue 3 or black 2. I think she's a black 2. Yeah, there she is. She's a black 2 interval. Okay, and question for Nick. Under Ariel Gutman's Venus point, I'm an evening star, but under the Venus Synodic, I'm a morning star, white one rising A. Any reason for the discrepancy? I don't know why she would say you're an evening star. You have to be one or the other. You can't be an evening star and a rising A. Either you're wrong about being a white one rising A, or you're wrong that under Ariel Gutman's Venus point, you're an evening star. But it's got to be one or the other. You can't be both. Marlon Brando's Unfiltered Life is quite disturbing. Yeah, sure. Cash and Taylor. This interval feels kind of dark. They all feel kind of dark. They all have their share of dark and light. Reading through the comments. Okay, you like the interviews, huh? Okay, the overviews rather. Okay, so I've read through. Okay, I think I'm wrong. Under Gutman, because you confirmed by synodic cycle, I'll have to recheck that. Yeah, please, check that that girl from yonder because it's got to be one or the other. All right, cool. Folks, I'm glad you've enjoyed that. Thank you. I know it's for some of you, it might just be boring. I'm reading through lists of people you may never have heard of and don't care about. But this really helps me as I run through the list and read it out loud as I'm sort of working out these different intervals into types, which is a big part of my mission, which I know from, a lot of you commenting on videos you really want me to do. So that's what I'm working on. And so this really helps me get at that. And I'll, on other days when I'm doing a solo live stream, other days when, because of course next week Watson will be back, and we'll probably talk. I'm keen to talk about the work he's been doing that I've been helping him with. But there's going to be some really interesting stuff there with regard to heliacal risings and settings, and putting them on a map, and really amazing advancements we've done there. And of course, tomorrow, I'm starting an hour earlier, and I'll have Sam here, and we're going to pick up where we left off 2 weeks ago, talking about the Red 5 interval and history of race relations in the U.S. But yeah, whenever I have a day like this, when I don't have a guest and there's nothing else to talk about, I'm going to take us through lists like this because it's helpful to me, and yeah, it seems like at least some of you enjoy it. No one's complained too much, and I mean, hey, what are you going to do? Get your money back? One last question. Chelsea Collins asks, what is the difference between a Venus star point and an interval? Well, the intervals are very different from the star points. What you really want to look at are the phases. When I have the rising B or the setting E, those correspond more to the star points, because what Ariel's doing in her book is she's just looking at the conjunctions of Sun and Venus. And that's exactly the point where the phases change, where you get from a rising phase to a setting phase, or a setting phase to a rising phase. The intervals are this other sort of wheel around it that determine Venus's speed and motion, and not whereas the phases determine whether or not Venus is rising before or after the sun. All right, cool. Thank you, folks. I had a lot of fun with that. Thank you for indulging me with the white threes and the black fours. And like I said, tomorrow I've got Sam Reynolds. Next week, I'm sure Patrick will be back next week. I know he's really keen to get back, and we're keen to move forward on some of the stuff we're working on together. So thanks for tuning in. Have yourselves a great day. I hope to see you all tomorrow, an hour earlier than today, with Sam Reynolds. It's going to be fantastic. And yeah, so tune in for that. And cheers. Have yourselves a fantastic